Hey everybody, this is Jake Wynn, Director of Interpretation at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We are here today at the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum in Washington, D.C. This is typically where I am stationed in non-pandemic times. Been working in and out of this location for quite a number of months now. Due to the pandemic, we have not been open here regularly at the Missing Soldiers Office, but within the last couple of weeks, we have opened for appointments. So if you're interested in visiting this site, you can go on to our website, civilwarmed.org or clarabartonmuseum.org. You can find out where you can reserve a tour time to come in and visit this place. We are going to be talking today about the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office. I'm going to be giving a virtual tour to all of you today. This video is obviously on Facebook. You can watch it here. This program, you can go back to the start and watch it later. This video will also be uploaded to YouTube. You can go to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine's YouTube channel, subscribe over there. That is youtube.com/NMCWM. While you're there, if you're watching this on YouTube, make sure to hit subscribe. Today, we are celebrating the beginning of Women's History Month. It is March 1st when we are recording this video. And this is going to start a month of special programs that we have, video programs related to women's history in regards to Civil War and Civil War medicine. We'll also be doing lots of social media posts as well. Links to our blog, photographs, items collection related to women's roles during the Civil War, again with a specific connection to Civil War medicine and Civil War nursing. We're very excited about that, and we love to be able to bring you inside this museum here in Washington, D.C. This is one of my favorite historic sites. I know I'm a little biased because I work here, but this place, this story that I'm going to talk about today is just really incredible. This building that we are in downtown Washington, D.C. on 7th Street, about 2 blocks north of the National Archives, very close to the National Portrait Gallery, is where Clara Barton lived for about 7 years of her life. Crucial time in Clara Barton's life where she is going to go from being a teacher and one of the first women to work for the federal government, to becoming a humanitarian, getting involved in nursing work, going out onto the battlefield and facing the dangers there, and trying to help soldiers on the field who may be suffering from wounds or disease. And then after the Civil War, she comes back here to what was a boarding house where she lived, and she turns that boarding house into an office to find what happened to all of the missing soldiers of the Union Army during the Civil War. And we're going to talk a little bit more in more detail about her remarkable work in the early years of Reconstruction that helps set forth a precedent that we still have today as we have official agencies of the Department of Defense that their sole job is to go and recover the remains and tell the stories of what happened to service members who disappeared in conflicts dating back to the Second World War. That precedent is started in the aftermath of the Civil War by Clara Barton. We'll also be talking a little bit today about this building and its history and a remarkable preservation story that takes place here in the 1990s. This museum, the Missing Soldiers Office Museum, is operated by the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, and we operate this museum in partnership with the General Services Administration of the federal government. They are the ones who, and employees of that agency, are the ones who made a remarkable discovery on the 3rd floor of this building that saved this building from destruction in the 1990s and allows the path forward to this becoming a museum in 2015 when we opened our doors for the first time. So we'll be telling kind of a two-part story today. As always with our live programs, if you have any questions, comments, thoughts on the program today, please drop those into the comments section. I'd be happy to interact with some of those. As you can tell, I don't have the ability to see them, see the comments. So my colleague John is on the other side of the camera today, and he'll be sending along your messages in the comment thread. Feel free, drop where you're watching from today. Any, again, questions or comments for me, I'm happy to answer those questions as we're going through the program today, as we're going through our tour, but also at the conclusion, we'll have some time set aside where we can address some of those questions. If you do enjoy these programs, please consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. It's the best way that you can get yourself involved and support programs like this and support this museum. One of the great perks, of course, about being a member to the museum is you get access for free to all 3 of our sites. So in addition to being able to go and visit the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland, whenever you'd like, you can also visit this site and come and experience where Clara Barton lived and worked during the Civil War, and in non-COVID times, get to experience some incredible programs that we do here and special tours that focus on the history in this building. And you also get access to the Pry House Field Hospital Museum at Antietam National Battlefield. So you get cool perks. You also support programs like this and get to help us keep our doors open as well. So it's a great way of supporting us, giving back, and also allowing us to continue telling the story of Civil War medicine. So we're going to get started with the tour here in just a second. Ooh, John's flashing me. What do we got, John?
Oh, just a host of people commenting. A real thank you for tuning in. Gary from Mount Airy, that has a nice ring to it. Linda from Hamlin, PA. You know, familiar faces like Ryan from Colorado, Wendy from Telford, PA. But we also have Kathy watching. Greetings from the Western Conservancy of Nursing History. So we got some great folks
awesome.
tuning in.
Yeah, thank you all so much for tuning in. Always great to see some old friends in the comments and new friends as well. So I hope you enjoy the program today. You can see more programs like this by subscribing and following our accounts here on Facebook, on YouTube, wherever you find these videos. That helps you to see more programs like this. All right, so before we head on upstairs and go and start walking in the footsteps of Clara Barton, I want to address the beautiful mural, very colorful mural that's behind me. This was painted in 2019 by who has become a great friend of the museum, an artist named Peter Waddell. So when you come into the Missing Soldiers office, when you do come in for your tour, you will actually be greeted by this almost immediately, this mural. It shows different elements of Clara Barton's experience while she lived and worked in this space, and it shows you some visualizations of some of the experiences that were really crucially important to Clara Barton's life and her work during the Civil War, and of course, with the term Angel of the Battlefield, which we'll get into a little bit more specific about how she came to get that nickname and how this building kind of ties into that story as well. All right, John, so are we ready to get rolling? Awesome. So we are going to head up to the 3rd floor of this building and go up into the restored 19th century boarding house. Now, one of the cool things about this is that the stairs that we're going to use to get up to the 3rd floor are the very same stairs that Clara Barton used. So we are going to quite literally be walking in Clara Barton's footsteps today. So follow me. So they are quite narrow and steep. You can imagine Clara Barton having to bring all of her supplies, everything that she needed out on the battlefield. She had to bring them up these stairs because she was using her boarding house room as essentially a storeroom. So she would have had to drag all of these boxes and heavy packages up these 2 flights of stairs to get up to her boarding house room. And this is the part where I usually get out of breath because these stairs are quite steep. All right. As John gets us set back up on the tripod so we're nice and steady. All right, so we've come up to the 3rd floor of this building. Just a little bit of the history of this building, what we know of it at least, is that this building was constructed in the early 1850s, was built with 3 floors. and very common in Washington at that time. The first floor, where we started this tour today, was a jewelry store at the time of the Civil War. The second floor were dedicated to professional offices. So we know that there were patent lawyers who worked there during the Civil War era. There was a dentist at one point during the Civil War that worked on the second floor. And one of my favorites, stumbled across an advertisement for the Washington Chess Club. Actually had an office on the second floor in 1863. So a variety and a host of characters coming in and out of this building for business purposes. But then the third floor of this building at 488 and a half 7th Street was dedicated to boarding house life. This is where people were living. And so what you'll see today as we're going through is a restored 19th century boarding house, taken back to the way that Clara Barton would have seen it. That includes some of the touches that you'll see throughout, and I'll mention them a few times as we go through the museum today. But the wallpaper has been restored back to what it looked like during the Civil War era. We have 19th century gas lighting here as well, if John just wants to take a quick look there. Showing that this building did have gas lights here while Clara Barton lived here. 7th Street was very important at the time of the Civil War in the mid-19th century, and was one of the streets, 7th Street was one of the streets that had access to gas lights. So that would have been here, a touch to this building during the time that Clara Barton lived here. Now, the important things that this building didn't have were those items include running water, no running water here, no bathroom facilities. So everyone who lives here is going to have a kind of a chamber pot situation. They're going to be taking their their business outside, so to speak. It does not also have a kitchen when Clara Barton moves in, although this whole section back here, which we won't spend too much time in today, was added in 1865, and that space did include a kitchen area. So for most of the Civil War, when Clara Barton was here, which was not all that frequent, especially as the war went on, she's oftentimes out with the army, she didn't have the ability to actually cook in this house, in this boarding house. So she didn't have the ability to do that. She'd have to go out for meals, which was pretty common, and Washington had apparently some really great restaurants in the 1860s. So a mecca of food development and restaurants here during the 1860s. A little bit about Washington. Washington at the time of the Civil War looked a lot like, if you were coming to visit, a lot of the buildings looked like this. And you see pictures from the 19th century in the Library of Congress collection. You'll see a lot of the buildings look very much like this one. So this is very representative of what people would have, how people would have lived during that time period. Washington was an unfinished city, and not a particularly beautiful one at the outbreak of the Civil War. Just as the Civil War changes Clara Barton's life and the trajectory of her life and career, the Civil War also does the same thing for the city of Washington. It's going to begin making a transformation of this city from kind of a backwards, strange, unfinished capital into a modern city. As soldiers and politicians and business leaders pour into the city during the Civil War and make it into the modern city that it is very much today. We can trace that back to the Civil War. All right, so we're going to... John, go ahead.
Yeah, quickly, just before we move on, a few great comments. Renee, in talking about the trip up the stairs here, you mentioned, Jake, not only imagining Clara Barton coming up, lugging all her stuff up here, but she adds, imagine doing it in heavy and long skirts.
Oh, yeah.
Quite an ordeal. And Rita also commented, said the public health nursing section of the American Public Health Association had the opportunity to tour this site back before it was redone. She says, what a difference.
What a difference indeed. And we'll get in a little bit later into today's tour. We'll talk a little bit about what this space looked like before the transformation, and ultimately how this building was almost lost to history, almost forgotten, almost lost to the wrecking ball, in fact, except for a kind of sheer happenstance group of events that leads this place to being saved, and the connection to Clara Barton is rediscovered. So, any other comments?
Yeah, quick shout out to Susanna for sending us some stars. We appreciate that. It's a new fundraising tool that Facebook has.
Awesome, thank you.
And then finally, a comment from our very own Karen Dahman that says, "Nice job, keep up the great work."
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Karen. We really appreciate the support and all that you and Dr. Dahman have done to get this museum started and to allow us to do all of the work that we do. We really appreciate you. Appreciate all that you have done to allow us to be here and doing these kinds of programs as well and working for the museum.
And quickly, Peggy just commented, "Is this being recorded? Would be great to share." The answer is yes. Once the stream finishes, this will be up on the Facebook page in perpetuity. So.
Yes, and for those of you who are wondering where that voice is coming from, it is my colleague John Lestria is behind the camera today. He is going to, he will be having access to the comments that you are all making and bringing them into our discussion today. So it's in a weird way, like all of you out there, wherever you're watching from, all around the country, are right here with us, and John is your medium today to bring you into the room with us. All right, so we're going to move through the back part of this building. Again, this section that we're going to pass through was added in 1865. We're not going to spend too much time in here, but I do love this space. I do. As John's trying to get us through There we go. If you'll notice, again, kind of a beautiful, beautiful building that we have here that is, again, restored back to its 19th century appearance. This back section of the building is kind of where we have some of our exhibits on Clara Barton. We also use this backspace for temporary exhibits as well. We did a display of the photographs taken by Alexander Gardner of Antietam. We did a display back here, and we're in talks to actually bring an escape room into these back rooms dedicated to Clara Barton's life and her time here. If John, if you just want to take a look in. These rooms, this room here was a boarding house room, just another of those rooms. There was a dining room was the previous room that we passed by. Now we're going to go into a kind of modern cut-through that connects the 1865 and the 1850s part of this building. We'll just keep coming through here. Now we're in the original front part of the building, and this was a boarding house room. This section is dedicated to talking a little bit about some of the architectural flourishes here and some of the decisions that were made in regards to historic preservation. So this space, you'll see that there's an area under plexi. I'm not sure how reflective it is for all of you. I see myself in there. But under the plexi, and this isn't the case in numerous places, shows what the wallpaper was like when this space was rediscovered in the 1990s. So this space, we talked a little bit about the building's history up to the time of the Civil War. And after Clara Barton lives here, she moves out of this building in 1868. This building keeps going on being a boarding house for the next half century. However, in the 19-teens, this space, all of this space up on the third floor of this building is boarded up and forgotten and left virtually untouched from about 1915 until the 1990s. And as the building is being prepared for demolition, people do have access to this building. They knock down a barrier, get into this space, and a GSA carpenter named Richard Lyons is going to come into this area in November of 1996 and make a remarkable rediscovery. But what I always like to point out is the areas under plexi, you'll see them in a few other spots. This is what it looked like when he came into the space. Imagine this brown, weathered paper, holes in the walls, holes in the floors. This space had been abandoned for almost 3/4 of a century, untouched, no running water, no electricity, and you would not expect to come into this space and make a remarkable historical discovery. But that is ultimately what is going to happen here. One of the cool parts of this, and John, if you want to pivot the camera around here, and this is the GSA put this together. The General Services Administration put forth major efforts into this rehabilitation of this building and bringing it back to its 19th century appearance. And what you see in this exhibit here is how they brought back some of the wallpaper. So specifically on the bottom section here are pieces of wallpaper that were discovered on site. And they are going to do some real detective work, some forensic work to bring it back to its 19th century appearance here and kind of recreate the wallpaper to give you the vibe when you come into this museum of what it was like when Clara Barton lived here, what it was like to be here during the mid-19th century and experience a boarding house from that time. So we see examples of how they were able to do that using these different scraps of wallpaper. Interestingly, just down the street when Clara Barton lived here was a store that sold wallpaper. So chances are probably good that the owners of this building did get their wallpaper from right down the street here. This section of Washington at the time of the Civil War is a real hustle and bustle of life. And pieces of that do come through, and we'll see some of the artifacts throughout the museum up here. You do start to see that, the artifacts that are left behind of train schedules, and some of the other elements of life, bags of food, things that connect this space to this neighborhood and the people who lived here at the time of the Civil War. All right, so we're going to keep moving here. We're going to leave room number 10. And we are going to go down the hallway. We're going to talk about somebody who's pretty important to this story, a gentleman named Edward Shaw. So we're going to go into his boarding house room here, right through here. I have my handy dandy picture of Edward Shaw here. I don't know if you can see that there, John. This is Edward Shaw. It's the photograph that is in the collection of the DC Historical Society, or DC History as they've rebranded themselves. Edward Shaw is really, really important to our story here. A native of New England, just as Clara Barton was. He becomes a clerk at the United States Patent Office, which is just down the street, about 2 blocks away from where we are now, what is now the National Portrait Gallery. And he is going to, in the early 1850s, make a business decision that is going to tie him to this building. He is going to become the landlord of this building in the early 1850s, and he's going to essentially sublet all of these rooms. He is going to rent this space and then sublet to tenants. Among those tenants is going to be Clara Barton in the 1860s. Shaw, we know a few things about him. A bachelor all his life, like Clara Barton, never marries, very much devoted to his work, very much in love with patent law in the 1850s and 1860s. Among the things that are found in the collection that is discovered here are numerous volumes of patent law related literature. So he's very dedicated to his work at the patent office. And he is going to be the landlord here for all of Clara Barton's time in this space. And he is going to play a role in the missing soldiers office as well by volunteering his time as a clerk. Now, another reason that Shaw is so important to the story we tell here is that, to put it bluntly, he is a 19th century pack rat or a 19th century hoarder. So if you want to pivot the camera around over here, John, we have some of the items that were found in the attic space, which we'll get to that discovery in just a moment. But many of the items that were found in this space that did reconnect this building to its 19th century past were items that belonged to Edward Shaw. So, example of a nightshirt. Some male slippers that very well may have belonged to him, and there are lots of correspondence and pieces of paper with Shaw's name on them that were found, including some letters between he and his mother back in New England in the 1850s, which are proved to be pretty amusing. Basically, the equivalent of "Why don't you write me more?" kind of letters. There were some photographs that were found in the space as well, a handful of those. But one of my favorite items that was found there in the space is a pair of long underwear that we don't have on display here, but are in the collections collections office in Frederick that have Edward Shaw's name written into the waistband. Now, what we know about Shaw from these artifacts that are left behind is that he probably didn't throw away much. Much of what was found in the attic space turns out was kind of like trash. He didn't get rid of anything. He was, again, kind of a hoarder and stacked all of these items that both he didn't need anymore and what other people left behind when they were when they would move out, including Clara Barton. That's how some of the items are going to be found with that Clara Barton connection. They're going to be stashed away in the attic by, we believe, Edward Shaw. So Shaw plays a crucial role in this story. And his connection to Clara Barton and his connection to this space is going to end up preserving this space. So it's a remarkable story of how his 19th century hoarding tendencies actually helped to preserve this building, because they are the items he left behind when he moved out of the building. At some point in the 1870s, those items are left untouched until they are rediscovered in the 1990s. So another fortuitous example here of these items being left behind and being left for future generations to rediscover and reconnect with this 19th century past. I do like to finish that story with Edward Shaw. He passes away in 1914. A pretty prominent member of Washington, D.C. He goes on to work for the War Department after the Civil War, a role that he has right up into the 20th century, working well into his 70s before he retires. He is, prominent in his day, but largely forgotten to history, especially because he didn't have any direct descendants, didn't have any children. But this discovery in the 1990s means that he now has his own collection connected to Clara Barton at the Library of Congress. So some pretty cool items, cool connections, and we get to tell his story here. So in a weird way, his connection to Barton in this building helps to preserve his legacy. And so we get to talk about Edward Shaw. He's one of my favorite people to talk about here at the museum. John.
Yeah, a question from David. He asks, why would the owners seal off and not use an entire floor of the building?
Great question. Great question. This, we believe, has to do with the fire codes here in Washington, D.C. In the early 19-teens, in 1911, there's a major disaster in New York City, the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, which results in changing of fire codes all across the United States, including here in the nation's capital. So building owners were being forced to make changes to their buildings to make them safer for tenants and those who were living in these buildings. And so the owners of this building made a decision to board up board up the space, stop using it, in order to avoid going to the expense of having to add a fire escape, add a second exit from this space. Those wooden stairs that we came up a bit ago were the only way in and out of this building in the 19th century. So this is a bit of a fire trap for the tenants living on the third floor here. But there's also a little bit of something in the fact that in 1914 and 1915, when this space is boarded up, the owners of this building hadn't gone to the expense of adding electricity or running water or telephone service or any of the modern amenities that they had by that time, and that were not necessarily new to Washington, D.C. They had not yet added it to this space. So the owners of this building are likely, even at that time, beginning to kind of forget about the space. They're not using it and make the decision ultimately to board it up. The building's front, the facade of this building does get covered with an ugly, I will say it, ugly facade in the early 20th century, and that covers up a lot of the windows. So it wasn't. If you're looking up at the building, you could see some of the windows on the third floor, but it's not abundantly clear that there is a third floor here that was being used, and the space is going to be ultimately pretty much forgotten for much of the 20th century. Great question.
Another comment from Kim in relation to Edward Shaw being a pack rat. Said maybe Mr. Shaw thought it far easier to put stuff in the attic versus hauling things down 3 flights of stairs to find someone or where to dispose of it. Good point.
Very good point.
Barbara asked a question which I think might serve as a good transition to where we're headed next. How much did Clara pay for rent as a boarder and later running the office?
So from her records, we know that she was paying about, I think, 50 cents a month for rent here. This is this is the amount of space that a boarder would have. This is where Shaw lived. This was his room. This is the amount of space that you would have, not only for yourself, your bed, all your stuff. It's not a super high-end way to live, although these rooms are actually, she moves out of a different boarding house because these rooms were bigger in 1861. We'll get to her and to Barton in just a second. But 50 cents a month. I'd have to go back and look, and I can drop this into the comments afterwards. I don't know off the top of my head how much she is paying for the entirety of the building when she is renting for the missing soldiers office after the Civil War. But for the most part, when this office is being used in full, the full third floor by 1866, Barton is using money from the federal government to pay for that. So it's not coming out of Barton's pocket. Necessarily, but her rent here, she is able to pay for that because she is working for the United States Patent Office for the time that she is living here as the Civil War breaks out. Great question. All right, we're going to continue moving on here. We're going to go back out into the hallway. We're going to hang a right, and we're going to go into Clara Barton's room.
I just had a question come through. Do these rooms have closets? Do they use wardrobes?
They would have had to have wardrobes. Another thing to have to carry up the stairs. They didn't have closets, so you'd have to, any storage you were going to have to bring in yourself. So this is Clara Barton's bedroom here at the Missing Soldiers Office Museum. You will note that it is significantly smaller than the previous room we were in. This is actually an example of what it would have looked like when Clara Barton was here after the Civil War. So while she's operating the Missing Soldiers Office from 1865 to 1868, this is the amount of space she leaves for herself to live in. She actually has a false wall put up that is going to allow more space next door into the Missing Soldiers Office itself for all of her clerks and all of the paperwork and documentation that she is collecting at the Missing Soldiers Office. So we'll see those rooms in just a second. So when Barton moved in here in 1861, this room would have been about twice as large as what we can see now. All right, so we're actually in the other half of Barton's room here. So we went on the other side of the false wall. So we're still technically in Clara Barton's bedroom here, where we're standing now. So Clara Barton, at the time of the Civil War, is trying to get her job back at the Patent Office. And she does successfully manage to get her job back when she, in early 1861, shortly after President Lincoln is inaugurated. She becomes very invested in what is occurring in the country. Of course, she lives here in Washington when the Civil War breaks out. So that means she has an upfront look at what's going on out there in the city. And that is, Washington is known as the seat of war. This is where the conflict is really taking place all around the city. Of course, Maryland and Virginia are both slave states separated from the North, which means that in order to get federal troops here to defend the city in early 1861 after Fort Sumter, Northern soldiers had to pass through the state of Maryland. And this situation is actually how Clara Barton initially gets involved in the Civil War directly. And that is when soldiers from her home state in Massachusetts are attacked and get into a fight on the streets of Baltimore on April 19th, 1861. Multiple people are shot and killed, including 3 of the soldiers from Massachusetts. Dozens more are wounded, more or less severely. And so when those soldiers arrive in Washington, Clara Barton is among the people to greet them. And she recognizes these young men of the 6th Massachusetts Militia. In some cases, men she knew since she was a child. In other cases that she had taught. And so she feels invested to assist these men in any way that she can. And she gathers supplies for them, takes them to their encampment at the United States Capitol building, which is where the 6th Massachusetts would spend its first days at war, in the United States Senate chamber. That was their camp when they arrived in Washington. And so this starts a role that Clara Barton is going to fulfill throughout the Civil War. She is going to, we think Clara Barton's oftentimes been thought of as a Civil War nurse. And while she does first aid and she's going out onto the battlefield, she is not a nurse in the way that Dorothea Dix was a nurse, or Florence Nightingale in Europe was a nurse. She is more of an aid worker, a relief worker. She gathers supplies for soldiers and distributes those supplies, first here in Washington and then ultimately on the battlefield as well. By 1862, she is going to the front lines, and she is famously going to become known as the Angel of the Battlefield in 1862 as a result of the Battle of Antietam. She takes 3 wagons full of supplies. Those wagons pull up just outside the boarding house here on 7th Street. She loads all her supplies that she stored here on site and at other warehouses she had in the city. And she goes off into the Maryland countryside, where she shows up at a 1st Corps Union Army hospital and single-handedly resupplies that hospital and provides, again, first aid care so close to the front lines, in fact, that as she's giving a soldier a drink of water outside the hospital, which was located in a barn, a bullet went through the sleeve of her dress, struck the man in the chest that she was giving this drink of water to. Killed him instantly in her arms. That's how close she was getting to the fighting. She's very courageous. And that courage was noted by one of the surgeons in that hospital, a guy named James Dunn. He served with the Pennsylvania Regiment, and he wrote a letter home to his wife after the Battle of Antietam and called Clara Barton the true heroine of the age, the angel of the battlefield. And because the Associated Press existed in 1862, that story, that letter, gets published in newspapers all across the country. And so Miss Clara Barton becomes very well known throughout the North, across the war zones, and she is going to keep that sobriquet with her for the rest of her days. In fact, Angel of the Battlefield is written on her gravestone in Massachusetts, where she's buried. So she carries that name with her very proudly. And she's going to continue to fulfill that role of Angel of the Battlefield throughout the Civil War, 1863 in South Carolina. If any of you out there have seen the movie Glory, 54th Massachusetts, Clara Barton is there, nurses some of the soldiers of the 54th after their fight at Fort Wagner in July of 1863. In 1864, she's back in this theater of the war, nursing soldiers, assisting soldiers, gathering supplies for victims of the battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, Cold Harbor, and ultimately going on to assist in running a hospital for the U.S. Army at Petersburg, in the vicinity of Petersburg, Virginia. By 1865, though, her job is coming to an end as a battlefield aid worker, relief worker. U.S. Army and the Sanitary Commission got really good at caring for soldiers, getting the supplies where they needed to go. And so she was looking for a new role to play. And she ends up at a place known as Camp Parole outside Annapolis, Maryland. And here she learns, of Andersonville Prison and learns of all of the soldiers who died there while being prisoners of war. And she understood that soldiers, there was no official notification system to let family members or next of kin know what happened to soldiers. So she decides to take some action. And so she is going to start, and we have a document here, all nice and blown up, which is perfect for us, the Office of Correspondence with the Friends of the Missing Men of the United States Army. You can see why we did not choose that as the name for the museum. The museum quickly, colloquially, I think I'm using that word right, becomes known as the Missing Soldiers Office. And so this is an example of one of the letters that is being exchanged with family members. This is a letter that is in our collection, known as the Painter letters. There's a series of them in our collection. This set of correspondence is taking place in 1865. Barton begins the Missing Soldiers Office at the end of the war. The war is still ongoing when she gets approval for that office. And this is going to become the work of her next 3 years of her life. And this is the space where that happened. So if we look out here, Again, this is where we do all of our programs here at the museum. If you come here on a tour in non-COVID times, this is where we really dive into what the Civil War experience was like for the soldiers, for Clara Barton, and ultimately the story we don't talk about as much is the aftermath of the war and what it meant to these families who lost loved ones during the conflict. This is an era before formal identification for soldiers, and so sometimes soldiers just vanished on the battlefield, disappeared, buried in unknown graves. And so what this office, and about the 10 clerks or so who work here, what they're trying to do is to reconnect the stories of these missing soldiers to their families, to let the families know what happened. And that has real value, not just in closure and emotional purposes, but also financially. These families are all Union soldiers that she is looking for. They are, because they died or went missing in the service of their country, their family members were able to access pension money, but you had to go through a pretty stringent process to get that. So you needed to confirm that your loved one was dead. And so what this office did in part is to help those families by finding the records, finding the comrades that served with those missing soldiers to confirm that those soldiers had indeed died in the course of their service. That didn't always happen. We actually have a group of letters it's in the Library of Congress collection that has been digitized thanks to the wonderful folks at LC. This series of letters is actually from a soldier who was alive and didn't want to be found. And that was something that did happen, that not everyone that Barton was looking for was dead. In fact, some of them had been deserters or had gone AWOL and simply went off and lived a whole other life, didn't necessarily want to be found. But over the course of about 3 years, from 1865 to 1868, this was a bustling office. This is the part of 3 separate boarding house rooms. Where the camera is and where I'm standing is in the other half of Clara Barton's bedroom. Right here is room 9. You can see basically where the room was based on these posts. Show where the original walls would have been, and then over there is room 7. The far side is room 7. So they take down the walls, make one large office, and Barton receives about $15,000 from the federal government, from Congress, to run and maintain this office, all of its correspondence, to be able to, this got to be quite expensive, more so than Barton could manage herself financially. She was basically living off of a little bit of the patent office money. She was still getting a salary from there, but that gets cut off during the Civil War because she's never here and not working, doing other things for the U.S. Army in a volunteer capacity. And so that in 1866, when she gets this money, she becomes really fully invested in this as the kind of superintendent of the missing soldiers office. Out of this office, they're going to do correspondence with 63,000 letters are going to come into this office. And in the end, about 22,000 Union soldiers are going to have some information about them and their fate relayed on to Northern families. Again, providing some closure, but also giving them the ability to get access to some pension money that was their due as a result of the pension law put in place in 1862 during the course of the Civil War. So this is where that all happened. I know it's not, we don't have it dressed up as an office. It would have actually been pretty boring, pretty much a run-of-the-mill 19th century office, lots of paperwork going on. You can imagine all the paper flying in and out with 63,000 letters. That's about 100 letters a day coming in and out of this office. Well, let's take a look at some of these artifacts here quick. And this one here actually is going to be a good transition for us to talk a little bit about how this building was saved. But before I get to that, do we have any questions or comments, John, that we might want to relay?
Yes, well, thank you to both Derek and John for sending us stars, a few hundred stars. We appreciate that. Let me see here. We've got people checking in from Los Angeles. And sorry about the connection issues we had earlier. If you missed part of the program, it should work to the point where when this is uploaded finally after the live stream's over, the connection problems won't be there. Is that right, Jake?
Hopefully.
Yeah, well, so we'll see. You can try and tune back into that. So thank you for bearing with us. Rich Condon, friend of the museum, has a great comment here, and we'll get to Clara Barton's work after the Missing Soldiers Office before too long here. She does a lot of humanitarian work. But Rich says Barton ends up back in South Carolina following the 1894 Sea Islands hurricane and is fondly remembered by some of those she helped 30 years earlier. So that's pretty neat. I didn't know that.
Yep.
And then John asks, can you speak on her later work during the Johnstown flood? I think we'll get to that just a little bit later.
Yeah, we'll pivot to that in just a second. I want to talk a little bit about some of the artifacts that we have here first, and we'll talk about the preservation story of this building, and then we'll transition on to talk about Barton's post Missing Soldiers Office life. So these items and all of the items that are found under glass here at the museum were all found on location. These items were all found tucked away in the attic above our heads. Now, this building was not designed with an attic. Instead, it is believed that Edward Shaw created some holes in the ceiling that he could access and use the attic space between the third floor ceiling and the roof, the eaves up there as storage space. And these were among the items that were tucked away in that space, about 1,000 artifacts in total. That were put up there in the 1860s and the 1870s and then forgotten until the 1990s. Among those items was this Missing Soldiers Office sign. This is very identifiable with the museum today. This was originally located at the bottom of the stairs out on the street, and this let people know, passersby, people who are coming in on business, family members, grieving family members looking for their loved ones, that the Missing Soldiers Office was located in room 9 on the 3rd story, and that this office was being managed by Miss Clara Barton. Now, what's really cool about this sign is, other than it is beautiful and hand designed, which is pretty cool, as are some of the other signs that we have here, and we also have some of them at the museum in Frederick, the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. But this sign is also the reason we are here today, because this is going to be the sign that is going to basically reconnect this place with the connection to Clara Barton. So in the years after Barton lived here, she moves out in 1868, she closes up the office. The work of the Missing Soldiers Office is left incomplete. In fact, family members continue to send Clara Barton correspondence and asking for updates if she has learned anything additionally about their loved ones that she had been looking for. But she pretty much turns around and never really thinks too much about the Missing Soldiers Office. She does write occasionally about it in speeches that she gives, talks a bit about it in correspondence, but for the most part, she moves forward. And she goes to Europe, and we'll get to what she does after that in just a second. But she turns around and never comes back. And she leaves some of the items behind. And so it is believed that Edward Shaw, or someone, puts these items that Barton left behind in this attic space. So flash forward through history, we're going to go through the end of the 19th century, into the 20th century. This space continues being a boarding house until around 1914, 1915, when this space is boarded up and forgotten. Outside, Washington changes, this neighborhood changes, bustles through the mid-20th century, but in the aftermath of the Second World War and the rise of the suburbs, many of these downtown neighborhoods really get hollowed out. And businesses leave because their clients have left. The people that sustained these businesses are now living outside the city in Virginia suburbs or Maryland suburbs. And so this neighborhood falls into some hard times in the 1960s and the 1970s. This building was being used as a shoe store from the 1920s until the 1990, in fact. But around this building, the neighborhood was experiencing some more difficult times. As a result of that, and this part of downtown Washington is going to get gobbled up into part of what is known as the Pennsylvania Avenue Development Corporation. This is chartered by Congress, and essentially it was an effort by the federal government to beautify downtown Washington. This is kind of that urban renewal effort that is being made in the late 20th century, which sees, unfortunately, the destruction of a lot of historic neighborhoods, including the neighborhood along Pennsylvania Avenue. which, for those of you that may be familiar with the photographs of the Grand Review at the end of the Civil War in 1865, you see lots of 2- and 3-story brick and wooden buildings lining Pennsylvania Avenue. Many of them were still standing in the mid to late 20th century before the PADC existed, and all of those buildings, for the most part, well, along Pennsylvania Avenue, are all gone, replaced by, for the most part, modern architecture along Pennsylvania Avenue. But this building gets absorbed into the PADC in the 1990s, and that organization ceased to exist in the 1990s, and so this building ends up in the hands of the federal government. The General Services Administration is going to be in charge of ultimately disposing of this building, which doesn't necessarily mean tearing it down, but does mean preparing it for sale to a private developer that likely would tear the building down. And so as that process was ongoing, a gentleman named Richard Lyons comes into this space, again, falling down, holes in the walls, the floors, wallpaper's peeling off. It's pretty ugly in here. He comes in here the day before Thanksgiving, 1996. He's by himself, and hears a car accident on the street and goes to one of the windows over here. If we want to pivot over here, John, goes to one of these windows, and he looks down onto the street outside, and he is going to see that there had been a car accident. And then he described what he felt as a tap on his shoulder, and he turned around. And this wall wasn't complete at the time. There was a kind of area, you can see in photographs from the time, an area over here where he could actually see into the other side of Clara Barton's bedroom. And while looking over there, he could see a hole near the ceiling, just large enough that a man could sneak through with a ladder. And beneath that hole was a letter. An envelope sticking out between the wall boards. And so he's intrigued by this. He goes over, takes down that envelope with a ladder, and then he does something I would never do, and I'll ask you to come back over here, John. He puts his hand into this hole in the ceiling, and he pulls out a piece of metal. And that's what he pulls out, that sign. And instantly, Miss Clara Barton, it becomes recognizable to him. He understood who she was, a Civil War nurse, founder of the American Red Cross. And then he puts his head into this hole in the ceiling and finds about 1,000 artifacts from the Civil War, all stacked nice and neatly up there in the attic, left behind from the 1870s and 1860s when those items were put up there and deposited there. So if it weren't for this discovery and this car accident, alleged tap on the shoulder, see the envelope, climb up there, put your hand in the hole in the ceiling, find this missing soldier's office sign, we would not be here today. So it's a remarkable historic preservation story in that this place is rediscovered. Now, how did the connection to Clara Barton get lost? Ultimately, Barton never returns to this space. The address is changed in the early 20th century, and this space is boarded up and left untouched. So this combination of address change, the loss of living memory, Barton dies in 1912, Edward Shaw dies in 1914, right around the same time that this is closed up. So all of these factors come together and play together to lose this place, to lose the collective memory that this place once existed on this site and in this building. And that is forgotten, and that connection is lost until that sign is rediscovered in 1996, and that sets the course towards this place being saved, preserved, restored, and ultimately opened to all of you as the Missing Soldiers Office Museum. So with that being said, I want to see if John, do we have any questions? And we can move on into the next room over here to begin taking questions and talk a little bit about Barton and the rest of her life.
Yeah, a question from Barbara. Did you know there was a missing soldier's office and just not know the location? Or was this all new information when this was discovered?
So it was the missing soldier's office was known. Barton's, in her biographies, books that are written about her in the 20th century, it is remembered. And people knew likely that it was in this neighborhood. They knew it was somewhere in this vicinity, but they did not necessarily know exactly where. And that's how it ultimately, the specific connection to this building gets lost to history because of the address change. And people weren't exactly clear where the missing soldier's office was. The door to get up here was kind of not easy to find. And to be honest, no one was really looking for it. No one was going out of their way to try to rediscover the missing soldier's office. So it gets left and kind of forgotten until, again, that discovery gets made. Great question.
And we might be about to get into this. Tom just commented, can you explain who Dorrance Atwater was and what he provided to Clara Barton?
Yeah, so this is a good place to talk about Dorrance. Dorrance Atwater is crucially important to this story. Again, we have a lot of ground to cover in a short span of time here, so I'm trying to kind of breeze through some of these elements. These are things that you would learn more about on a visit here. But Dorrance Atwater was an inmate at Andersonville Prison in 1864. Previously at Belle Isle, he was a Union soldier. He's captured in 1863, goes through prison camps in Richmond, and then ultimately to Andersonville in 1864. He was brought into the hospital at Andersonville as a clerk. Had some clerking experience, and he was the one in charge of keeping the death registry at Andersonville Prison. And so he makes an illicit second copy of the death register that he is keeping on his person. The Confederate government was keeping a list of those who were dying in the camp hospital there, and Dorrance Atwater didn't trust the Confederate overseers of the camp, which, for those of you who know the history of Andersonville Prison, that is understandable. And so when he is transferred out of the camp, smuggles out that list with him. And ultimately, in 1865, he is going to turn that list over to the federal government. He is going to befriend Clara Barton, and he is going to become a friend and eventual worker in this office with Clara Barton. And they're going to go out on the speaking circuit together. And it's because of Atwater's list of most of the deaths and resulting being able to identify where they're buried in the National Cemetery at Andersonville, that about 13,000 of the 22,000 names of soldiers that are discovered or rediscovered by the Missing Soldiers Office, that's where they come from, that Dorrance Atwater list. So that's a crucial connection. Dorrance Atwater is incredibly important to this whole story. It actually relates to one of these lists over here. So Dorrance Atwater has a list of the soldiers that pass away at Andersonville. And there are other lists associated with this site as well. This is probably my favorite artifact from the Missing Soldiers Office. This was found on site here at the building here on 7th Street. This is Roll of Missing Men number 5. And this is what it says here out in the left-hand corner. It's names, hundreds of names of soldiers. And this is what it says at the top. It says, to returned soldiers and others, Washington, D.C., January 1st, 1867. Soldiers and friends of soldiers. This roll, like the preceding, contains only the names of persons whose friends have written to me for information, and about whom, up to this date, I have learned nothing definite. Please examine it, and if you know what became of anyone here named or have facts of interest to his friends, communicate them to me by letter with your address in full. The information will be forwarded to the friends inquiring. If anyone sees his own name and that of a comrade or that of a comrade known to be living, he will please inform me. I have to thank friends everywhere and especially returning soldiers for the large amount of information sent to me. Clara Barton. So this is a list of names assembled by the Missing Soldiers Office of missing soldiers. They are organized by state. We also do have a large group of United States regulars that is actually mostly made up of men who served in United States colored troop regiments, so USCT. So she is looking for both white and black soldiers as well. This is an integrated list, essentially. And so this is, by and large, how the Missing Soldiers Office communicated with the outside world. So people would send in their information looking for someone. The name would go on the list, and Barton and the Missing Soldiers Office would ask for others to send information about those soldiers. This is the last list. This is the last one published. Most of those on this list are not found. No information is going to be passed on to those families, which is pretty tragic when you're looking at this list of hundreds of names and knowing that their families aren't going to get any closure. Many of the soldiers would have died. Others were still alive and had chosen to desert. But Barton does close up the office. In 1868, she walks away from this office physically, emotionally, mentally exhausted, and she goes to Europe. In 1869, she stays with the family of someone who worked in this office. A soldier had served for the U.S. Army during the war, had been wounded in 1864, and who Clara Barton had nursed back to health. After the war, he came to work in this office. And so when she needed a place, a refuge from her experiences during the Civil War to get away from it all, this soldier offered up his family's place in Geneva, in Switzerland. And so Barton goes to Europe, and while there learns about the International Committee of the Red Cross, learns about them, becomes intimate with the work that they did, is going to participate and see the Red Cross work firsthand during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and 1871, and decide the United States needed to be part of this. And so in 1882, after almost a decade of lobbying, she becomes the first president of the American chapter of the Red Cross. And she changes the Red Cross from being a wartime relief organization to being a organization that also responds to natural disasters. And man-made disasters as well. Going to the comment about the Johnstown flood, one of the first major large-scale disasters that she is going to go and respond to with the American Red Cross is the Johnstown flood in 1889. A dam bursts, it destroys utterly the town of Johnstown and its surrounding areas. And Barton shows up with her American Red Cross, forms up a hospital, does relief work, gathers supplies from all over the country, and basically single-handedly staves off a public health nightmare in Johnstown, helps to keep people fed, and is long remembered by the residents and the survivors of the Johnstown flood as being crucial to their survival in the aftermath of the flood. And she does this all over the country, as Rich Condon mentioned in the comments earlier, goes back to South Carolina where she was during the Civil War in the wake of a hurricane in the 1890s. Not only in the United States, but also around the world. Some relief work in Cuba before the Spanish-American War, to the Ottoman Empire in the 1890s as well. Sees the kind of coming tide of what will become the Armenian genocide in the early 20th century. She sees that beginning and gets involved in humanitarian law. Ultimately, she passes away in 1912 at the age of 90, having utterly reshaped America and the world and becoming one of the most famous women in history, bar none, because of her role. This is the place, this is where it all started for her. This is where she goes from being a teacher, government employee, to becoming a humanitarian, and learning the lessons that she is going to apply for the rest of her life. Running an organization, administering an office, gathering supplies, distributing those supplies, doing first aid work, going on to the battlefield. All of these experiences she has during the Civil War. This building in Washington, D.C. is home base. This is where she returns to. This is where she gathers her supplies. And this is where she founds the Missing Soldiers Office and is going to reunite all of those thousands of families with at least some pieces of information of what happened to their loved ones. So this crucial place, this spot where Clara Barton's life changes, was almost forgotten, almost destroyed. But thanks to Richard Lyons and the GSA, and now the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, it is open to the public, available for you all to see. Again, I encourage you to come, schedule an appointment, come for a tour, come see this place firsthand, commune with this history, and then consider becoming a member of the museum and supporting this place, allowing us to continue this work, allowing us to add new exhibits. You'll be directly supporting those efforts and along the way, you get to come and see the place for free, see the programs for free, and help us to continue sharing this legacy of Clara Barton. All right, so that's going to be an end of my formal program. I'm going to turn it over to John here for any comments, questions. If you do have any, please throw them my way. I'll be happy to answer them here, or if we run out of time in the aftermath of the program, we will write out some answers to those questions we didn't get to.
Yeah, I know we've already been going a little bit long. We're at about 1:06 now. A lot of great questions. We won't be able to get to them all, but at least we can get to one here. Let me go back. Well, Bill said, I toured this very important building a few years ago. It's such an extraordinary story that needs to be told and appreciated. Tom asks, after Clara Barton left and the building was boarded up, were any of the larger artifacts like the desks or the letters from soldiers thrown out, or what happened to those?
Oh, a great question.
That I'm sure we would like to know the answer to as well.
Yeah, it's a great question. Unfortunately, there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot of questions that we still have about this office, what it looked like, how it operated, and ultimately what happened to all of that correspondence. There are a handful of the 63,000 letters that came into this office that do survive. Some are in the Library of Congress Clara Barton collection. That is accessible online, has been digitized, so you can actually find the surviving documentation from the missing soldiers office there. A handful of other documents have been found in the National Archives, in pension records that are kept by the National Archives. We have a few items in our collection related that are from the National Museum of Civil War Medicine collection as well. But the lion's share of missing soldiers' office letters, the correspondence, the documentation, is nowhere to be found. Was not found here, was not discovered on site. So big question marks surround a lot of this work, unfortunately. So, who knows? And we might find something in an attic somewhere else someday with all of these troves of letters. As it's turned out in so many different times in Clara Barton's life that these documents and things do turn up. Maybe we'll get lucky, but we're very fortunate to be able to have that small sampling, at least, in the Library of Congress collection.
Kim asks, is there a master list of all that was found in the attic by Mr. Lyons? And to the extent that one does exist, we have it in our collections database. There's, for every really incredible artifact, like the missing soldiers office sign, there's, probably, 8 or 10, little bits of junk, like little scraps of paper with nothing on them, and wood splinters and things like that. Yeah,
I'll add too, so that you can get in touch with our collections department if you are interested in the specifics there. That information does exist. I will say we do have a database available on our website, civilwarmed.org, that contains all of the names that appeared on the missing soldiers office rolls. So if you have an ancestor who went missing during the war or died as a prisoner of war and want to know whether or not their family were looking for them or friends were looking for them, you can actually go and search the database for those names to see if they appeared on Clara Barton's list.
So with us coming up on about 1 hour and 10 minutes here, I think we'll draw to a close. I know there's other questions here. We'll do our best to get to them when we can.
Yes. Well, thank you all so much for joining us and sticking with us. I know we had a little bit of a technical hiccup there in the middle of the program, so thanks for sticking with us. If you did enjoy the program today, please consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. You'll support programs like this, of course, and allowing us to get cool technology, like we've got mics, we got new technology that is available to us to make these tours better. We're always trying to find ways to make the programs better for you all, and we're going to keep doing these virtual programs. So you'll be directly supporting those. You also get to come and visit these places for free and enjoy the programs that we do in non-COVID times in these spaces as well. Lots of great programs with historians, special tours. You get access to those as a member of the museum. You can also support us though by just clicking the like button, click that share button, subscribe if you're watching over on YouTube. That allows more people to join in the conversation, and your friends and their friends to join in and to learn what we do, to learn more of this very important history and how it can still help guide us today. We believe very strongly that we can find hope in history, and you can directly support that by becoming a member, sharing, subscribing. Every little bit helps us to continue to further our message and fulfill our mission. So thank you all so much for joining us today. We're gonna head out for now, but tune in later this week. We've got another great program coming up on Friday where you get to see my colleague John's face and our docent Brad Stone talking about African American sailors in the United States Navy during the Civil War. It's going to be a great program. You can watch that over on Facebook, here on Facebook, and over on YouTube as well. Until then, hope you all have a great week. Thank you so much.